it resides in American politics. Like, it is much easier to point the finger south than it is to point the finger at ourselves and say, can we start talking about legalization? Can we start talking seriously about what it would take to go back to Richard Nixon and say, this is a health issue. This is a poverty issue.
Like ants in a colony, organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene.
Due to what this producer can only assume to be attempts by the deep state to sabotage the recording of this interview, the original file was corrupted. However, through the power of solidarity, dialectical materialism, and the technology of history, most of the information was recovered with less than a minute of the conversation lost. We will redouble our operational security to ensure you, dear viewer, receive your subversive history uninterrupted.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Subversive History interview. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Robin Kirk. Robin Kirk has an impressively diverse resume, which includes working as a human rights activist, a teacher, an author of both fiction and nonfiction, and even an award-winning poet. She spent 10 years working for Human Rights Watch. She is the faculty co-chair of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, and she's a professor in Duke's Department of Cultural Anthropology. Specifically relevant to this interview, she wrote a book titled More Terrible Than Death: Massacres, Drugs, and America's War in Colombia, which we will primarily focus on today. Earlier this year, I spent 6 weeks in Colombia, and I brought this book with me, and I found it to be a fantastic resource for contextualizing Colombia's conflict. So we're very excited to speak with you today. Robin Kirk, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. So, Robin, before we get into the specifics of the book, for those who are unaware in our audience, could you maybe just let them know your background and experience with Colombia that qualifies you to comment on the subject?
Sure. I started working in Colombia in around 1995 and continued there until 2004, coming in and out for Human Rights Watch. I was the primary researcher for Colombia and wrote almost all of the reports that were published at that time. And we were always looking for ways to talk about the human rights situation that was not only relevant to what was happening on the ground in Colombia, but was also reflected the relationship between Colombia and the United States, because obviously we were in part using the United States-Colombia relationship as a lever to improve the human rights situation there. And it was at the time a real challenge to understand for me the particularities of the Colombian situation, given the immense amount of money that was coming into Colombia through the drug trade. So I think from a human rights perspective, it was really new territory, because in the past I'd worked in Peru, for example, where there was also a drug economy, but it wasn't so pervasive and it wasn't so huge, so that you could kind of understand the human rights situation from a more traditional perspective. Government does these abuses, guerrillas do these abuses. But in Colombia, the amount of, implicit U.S. funding through consumers, not through the government, but through consumers, was something I really had to learn about. I certainly was not an expert when I started working in Colombia about that, but that was something I had to get up to speed on very quickly.
What motivated you initially to pursue human rights activism in this way, to work with Human Rights Watch and everything?
Well, I had started as a journalist in Peru, and when the war between the government and the Shining Path was just getting started, and I was, it sounds a little ghoulish, but I was fascinated by this, guerrilla insurgency that was rooted in academia, that was run by a philosophy professor.
Gonzalo,
yeah.
Gonzalo, that was his name. Right, yeah.
His real name was Abimael Guzman, and he was a professor, and a lot of the early leaders of the Shining Path were professors. Wow. And the cadre, the people that fought for them, were their students. Wow. And getting your mind wrapped around what would convince a young person to adopt the kind of ideology that Guzman talked about was really hard. So one of the one of the pieces I did that was most kind of transformative for me was doing a piece on the women of the Shining Path, because
Right.
the unusual in Latin America, women had leadership roles within the Shining Path military. They were field commanders. That was not the case in Cuba, certainly
Yeah.
not the case in Colombia. So what would make a young woman, especially a woman with an indigenous past, what would make them pledge themselves to this, military, and also commit, horrific acts of violence? So that was something that then kind of roundabout brought me to human rights, because you had this very extreme guerrilla movement whose main targets was the left in Colombia. It wasn't necessarily just the military and the police. It was also, the progressives were big targets. So from a human rights perspective, it was like, what would compel a guerrilla insurgency to attack people who I thought were doing, the right thing? And then what would then compel the military and the police to also, so you had human rights leaders caught in the middle. So I found that very intriguing, compelling, and I ended up wanting to do work that was not, journalism is a fixed thing. You do the piece, you do the article, and then you move on.
Right.
I really wanted to be involved in human rights because I wanted to find a way to actually improve people's lives.
Wow. Okay. So I knew very little of your work outside of your book on Colombia prior to preparing for this interview. And during that process, I discovered that you had written a series of novels known as the Bond Trilogy. As someone who reads a lot of history books, I found this somewhat surprising, as most historians I read don't transition to fiction. However, the surprise quickly evaporated after reading your book, More Terrible Than Death, a second time. Your writing is so much more engaging and poetic than the typical work of history, and it became quickly apparent to me that your writing talent would easily translate to novels. One device that you utilize that gives your book a novel-esque feel is the way that you use your close friend and colleague, and I hope I'm saying this right, Josue.
That's very good. Josue.
You did like a phonetic breakdown of the book that I highlighted to be like, I need to remember this. So you use Josue's life and experience to guide the narrative of Colombia's history. Your book, titled More Terrible Than Death, is named after a statement made by Josue, and he is the central character throughout the book. So I feel it would only be right to begin the interview the same way. Can you tell our audience who Josue is and why he's so important to you in the overall story?
Yeah, I met him. In fact, I have a photograph of him right next to me on my desk. I met him early on in my time in Colombia, and he was a businessman. He was, at the time that I met him, he directed the aguardiente factory in the town of Villavicencio, which is in the towards the eastern part of Colombia. And he was also a member of the Patriotic Union Party, which had come out of an early demobilization effort where the government and the main guerrilla group in Colombia, the FARC, had agreed to create a pathway for these former guerrillas to integrate into the normal political system,
right?
Very much like the IRA did in Northern Ireland, where you had a process by which the IRA kind of transmuted into Sinn Féin. And I just found Josue fascinating, but also so funny and so human. And he had his business career, but he was also passionately committed to human rights. So he would drive me around in Villavicencio and introduce me to people, refugees, other members of the Patriotic Union. But there was always a sense with him that his life was on borrowed time. He knew that he was really pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be politically active in Colombia. And I think I start the book talking about an early assassination attempt that he had survived. And it was very cinematic the way he described it to me, because everybody in the town where he was at that time knew what was happening. Right. And that's so much a part of the Colombian story, is that so much of this violence is not secret. It's not, you don't know who did what when. Right. Everybody knows exactly what's going to happen. And Josue had survived this. And at the time when I met him, he was married, he had kids. And I just was so struck by how he could do this kind of work, knowing that his life was on the line, and still do it anyway. And that's where that quote comes from, more terrible than death. For him to not be engaged in making Colombia a better place was the fate that was more terrible than death, that he was willing to face that almost certainty for the hope that he would make Colombia a better place.
And it really is a beautiful way of weaving the history through a very humanized and personal way. Like the same, like I was saying, it makes it feel novelesque, where it's like, I feel like I'm building a relationship with this character as we read through, and it makes the whole thing so much more, not only compelling, but also just kind of enjoyable to read as well. But yeah, so just to get a little bit into the specifics of the book now, the second chapter to your book is titled I'm sorry, my Spanish is terrible, Basilisco. Mm-hmm. Right, which essentially I think means like snake or basilisk, which is
kind of a monstrous character.
Okay, yeah, which is a metaphor for like subversive communism taking hold of Colombian institutions. The term was coined by conservative President Laureano Gomez in 1949. Can you explain how this concept of basilisco would serve as a catalyst for Colombia's conflict?
Yeah, I mean, for Americans, I think sometimes this is hard to understand. The role that anti-communism played in post-World War II Latin America, because right. At that time, the United States, in the midst of the Cold War, which began even before World War II ended, the United States was extremely worried that communism would take root, and the Soviet Union particularly would take root in Latin America. So the United States became very close to certain militaries. Colombia was one of the first. I think Colombia was the only military that sent soldiers to Korea during the Korean War. The militaries, the U.S. and Colombian militaries were very close and trained together. And Colombian officers went to the United States to train. And part of that training was this deep, deep fear of communism. And there was reason to be fearful of it, because what was happening in Cuba was very present to people. Here you had the Soviet Union being engaged and putting missiles into an island, 90 miles from Florida. Mm-hmm. So this was a very real to a lot of Colombians, to a lot of Peruvians, Brazilians. That's when you have various military coups in Latin America fueled by this idea that communism is going to take over. And you had also in Colombia the longest running, the oldest guerrilla insurgency in the Americas, older even than Cuba. The FARC starts out of a period of time in Colombian history called La Violencia, which was a kind of peasant rebellion against the kind of landed ranchers, the people with a lot of money. Mm-hmm. So the anti-communism and the elites of Colombia kind of merge, and this campaign starts against anything that even had a whiff of communism. So obviously the guerrillas, the FARC in that period, but any sort of leftist political movement became sort of grandfathered into this anti-communist campaign. So union leaders, human rights leaders, progressive politicians like Josue were kind of grandfathered into this anti-communist ideology. So killing, for instance, a union leader became just as justifiable as killing a guerrilla in a lot of the mindset of the Colombian security forces. So I think we in the United States had a kind of a similar moment with McCarthyism, with the fear of communists taking over the State Department. It never made it to the point of an armed insurgency, obviously, but with some, the Weathermen and some of the, small
Black Panthers. Yeah.
Say again.
You like the Black Panthers and the Weathermen.
Exactly.
Maybe a little bit.
And the leaders of the Black Panther Party. Yeah. I think he was 21. I mean, he was just 21.
We just interviewed his son in Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, and so that, the kind of reaction to that in the United States was also ferocious. So in Colombia, the anti-communism is very, very deeply embedded in the kind of the ruling classes and within the Colombian, especially the Colombian military.
Do you see like any kind of like parallel? Like I know you brought up McCarthyism, but like even like currently in the United States, this same type of ideology of like, because I remember like reading in your book, they would accuse the people of Human Rights Watch, even yourself, of being like secret guerrillas and things like that. Like, do you see like things like that today where they say that like, the teachers are communists and the university professors are communists, and there's this kind of like subversive kind of like sneaking insidious communism that's trying to take over the American institutions?
I mean, that's an interesting question. This idea of woke being kind of this
exactly
thing, and CRT being this sort of, embedded in our elementary schools. And it's like, no, that's not happening. But it has become this sort of article of faith among certain parts of our politics. And, thankfully, it hasn't resulted beyond say something on January 6th. But I do. I think a lot of people who have backgrounds in Latin America are concerned about certain behaviors repeating. I think one of the things that I'm really concerned about is the proposal that the military be used in civilian conflict. Yes. And this is something that Latin American militaries in particular are extremely familiar with. I think things have changed in Colombia now to some degree, and Latin American militaries in many places, I can't say all, but in many places are very aware of the dangers of getting involved in quelling civilian protest, whether it be a march or a public rally or something like that. That has not gone well in Latin America, and I hope that the incoming administration in the United States learns that lesson. Using the military to manage civilian unrest almost always ends in disaster.
Thank you for your commentary on that. Just to kind of get back into the historical development, that was just kind of like a side question I had. But at one point,
no, it's a very pertinent one. It's very timely. Yeah.
So just to kind of go back, you mentioned La Violencia, and there's a part of your book where when you're interviewing someone, you said like their story begins like many Colombians with La Violencia. So can you like explain what this period consisted of and the impact that it would have on Colombia? Because this is where we can really kind of like find a line of like kind of how we got to the proceeding decades. There
are at the time there were two political parties in Colombia, the liberals and the conservatives.
Right.
To an American, they wouldn't be recognizable. And in fact, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the wonderful Colombian novelist, said at one point that the only difference between them is the time that they went to mass on a Sunday. There really isn't a ideological difference between them. There is a tribal difference. You either grew up liberal or you grew up conservative, kind of a little bit like being Protestant and Catholic in Northern Ireland. It's not really about faith. It's more about your community, like which community do you grow up in? And so the violence at that time was just really grounded in these sort of family relationships and histories of belonging to one or the other party. And partly one of the big moments of Colombian history that people will point to is the assassination of the kind of charismatic political leader that led to the suppression of any sort of more progressive ideas of how to run the country. And so for many, many years, Colombia was run by very conservative, very tied to business kind of concerns that didn't allow for a kind of a more progressive, more open way of doing politics. And so for especially farm people, peasants, rural people, this left them with kind of a choice of, do we go along with that, or do we start to support, say, a group like the FARC, which was a peasant-based guerrilla insurgency, or then, starting in the 60s and 70s, some of the newer guerrilla groups, because at one time, Colombia had 5 or 6 different iterations of time.
No, you're good. There was a little pause, but we're back.
Yeah. So the conservative liberal sort of stranglehold on politics really starts to break apart in the 1980s with the increase in political violence that comes with the war on drugs and other things.
So would you say that it's safe? Like, obviously there's this conflict that we've been referring to, and like the two main antagonists of this conflict would be FARC, mainly from the guerrillas, and then also the paramilitaries. Would it be safe to say that it was like from like the ashes of of La Violencia is where we find these two groups kind of being born out.
Yeah, and La Violencia was incredibly destructive to the Colombian, rural areas. So a lot of people that I met during the time I researched there were refugees from La Violencia. So you get the explosive growth in cities like Bogota and Medellin, with families fleeing rural violence with nothing.
Yeah, I think like 1% of the population of Colombia's population died during this period as well. I was just reading the Wikipedia. So obviously a very, very traumatic event throughout the country. I guess something that I wanted to ask, because like obviously reading through your book, you gave so many examples of, atrocities committed by FARC, like absolutely inexcusable, atrocities that have, soiled whatever kind of like ideological claim that they would have had. But obviously this platform that you're currently on here, we're definitely of a very leftist bend, a very Marxist bend. So kind of like what I want to ask is that in the initial formation of FARC, do you think that they had like a justified and logical, endeavor at that point, but like prior to like obviously the excesses that were committed later on?
I mean, it's a good question. I think that certainly you could say that the nonviolent avenues for political engagement were completely cut off, especially for rural people. What in Latin America you'd call peasants, campesinos.
Yeah.
And I guess I would refrain from saying legitimate, but I would say that I can see why many people thought that the only avenue for expressing their political views and changing what was a very, very unfair system was violence. What has happened in Colombia over the successive decades is that there have been different attempts to provide avenues for guerrillas to integrate into society, but almost always those avenues have resulted in the extermination of those groups, so that any sentient person would look at Colombia in the 80s and say, this is insane. Why would I join something like Josue did? Why would I join the Patriotic Union Party if I am just going to be exterminated? Right. So for many, many years, Colombians saw that their only real avenue of changing the system was by taking up arms. So again, I don't feel I'm an American. I'm not a Colombian. Yeah. I don't feel like I can justify that, but I can certainly see why many people chose that avenue.
Yeah, I think that was a very appropriate answer, and I appreciate your insight on that. Later in your book, you introduce one of, probably the most well-known figure in Colombian history, who is Pablo Escobar of the Medellin cartel. With all the Netflix series and the other media exposure, I think many Americans may oversimplify the violence in Colombia to be merely an extension of the criminal cocaine enterprise, like any other criminal syndicate around the world. It's just, violence goes hand in hand with these types of things. Would you agree that this kind of romanticized and fantastical depiction of Colombian history serves to kind of distill the broader social and political implications that surround it? Sorry, not sure if you caught that one. I think we froze a little.
Not only in terms of Colombia, but in some countries that have been, parts of U.S. foreign policy, is there countries that, for instance, in the case of have always been and will always be violent. And that is just not true. And I think that, Josue, part of also the reason why I chose Josue is because Josue believed in a nonviolent path to changing the country. And so many Colombians have believed in, whatever you want to call it, democracy, progressivism, what have you. And it is the forces that they're struggling against make it almost impossible to achieve those goals. And in the 80s, starting in the 70s with Escobar and then going into the 80s with the paramilitaries and the 90s, so much of that violence was, you could relate it to, not entirely, but a lot of it, to the influx of American dollars through the cocaine industry. So one of the things that there's a famous saying about Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. And you could say the same about Colombia. It's like that this relationship with the United States through the drug trade really deformed Colombian politics for many, many years. And Escobar was Escobar and the people in his sphere, the Ochoa brothers, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, who were the Cali cartel. In fact, the Cali cartel people, one of them is just like half an hour north of me now. He's in the federal
in the prison. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other one's in Georgia. So
okay.
One of them died. I think the one in Butner recently died. But but these kingpins, cocaine kingpins, are there by the grace of the United States. So I would just say that, this is kind of a roundabout answer to your question, but I think that that we have to be very, as Americans.
So just to kind of talk about that too, is like one thing that I realized kind of about that, like what I feel like was my own personal misconception is that like when I've always heard like this term, the Colombian necktie, right? And I assume that that's just like something born of like the cartels or something like that. And it turns out that that's actually something that was first, I guess you could say, invented. And for those that don't know, I'm not going to describe it in detail, but it's a pretty brutal form of execution. Actually was something that was invented during La Violencia. It had nothing to do with the cocaine trade or the cartel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is that I began to see that kind of violence as a kind of language,
right?
And so that which started during La Violencia, where the violent groups, whichever they were, would behave in such a way and do things to bodies and leave them in place, almost like a scene from a work of theater, as a way of communicating to the survivors that this is what we are capable of doing this to you, and we will do this to you if you don't do what we want. And in the 90s, we saw this with the paramilitary groups, that they would do very similar things. And in fact, their first kind of nickname became the head cutters, because they would mutilate bodies in such a way as to not only kill the people involved, but send a message, such a strong message to the survivors that you are also subject to this kind of violence. And so that was a very strong way of getting people to do what you wanted.
Right. So we already kind of have introduced, just as we're talking about Pablo Escobar and introducing him to this story, we already discussed the formation of FARC, but Pablo Escobar, aside from, everything in the Medellin cartel, also had a hand in conjuring the other side of the war, meaning the paramilitaries. So can you explain like the birth of MAS, aka Death to Kidnappers, and the sectors of Colombian society who financed their creation?
Sure. As I said, I think earlier, that there were various guerrilla groups that were created in Colombia, and one was called the M19, which was based in universities, kind of like the Shining Path. It was based in universities, and so a lot of students. And they decided that one of their big kind of ways of introducing themselves was to steal the sword of Simón Bolívar, as kind of the George Washington of Latin America, of Latin America. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing they did was they kidnapped family members of the Ochoa family who were associates of Pablo Escobar. And this drove the Escobar and his group batty, because here they had all this money and power, but this group of, stringy-haired university students had kidnapped their family members and was asking for a ransom. So that was the beginning of MAS, which was, in Spanish, it's death to kidnappers, muerte a secuestradores. And MAS then quickly became a vehicle for the drug traffickers to attack not only the M19, but the other guerrilla groups, the EPL in the north, the ELN kind of in the central part of the country, the M19, and the FARC. So suddenly, I mean, it was really actually quite fast. I think it was in, I'm not going to remember the years right now that happened, but it was in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. Very quickly, a lot of the money that was coming in from the United States, from, the cocaine economy, started to be in MAS, Escobar, and others, including the Castaño brothers, who are another kind of, they were also in Narcos, but as kind of as a lesser character, began to invest in guns and uniforms and soldiers. And that's the beginning of in the 90s, the paramilitary groups that began to dominate, especially from the north. The Castaño family also suffered a kidnapping by the FARC. The FARC kidnapped the Castaño brothers' father and actually killed him. So it was a kind of an internal war between the guerrillas and the paramilitaries. But again, this anti-communist sentiment was something that the paramilitaries also believed in part because the reason they're called the paramilitaries is because they were working with Colombia's military. So they kind of absorbed a lot of that anti-communism from their military sort of buddies and patrons. Yeah. So the paramilitaries not only killed and attacked members, guerrillas, but also began to attack union leaders, human rights leaders, progressive leaders and members of the Patriotic Union Party, including Josue. So that became kind of this secret, kind of not so secret war that was happening when I was working in Colombia. That was kind of the main event, was this alliance between the military and the paramilitaries, and this kind of fracturing relationship among the guerrillas and in terms of the guerrillas vis-a-vis the paramilitaries and the military. So it was a complicated war.
Right. But also there was as I read in your book and in other places, there was also other factors as well. Like when they were initially forming MAS, it was not just like the cartel, right? There was like a Texas oil executive. There was other like ranchers and elites of Colombian society that were there. So like, it wasn't, purely just for like the advancement of like cocaine traffic consolidation, but also there was also an element of like business consolidation as well with it, correct?
Yeah, no, very much so. Because you had these wealthy ranchers in particular who were also subject to kidnapping by the FARC. So they invested in this and they became leaders. And, for them, they didn't really care about the cocaine economy in the sense that they weren't against it. A number of them would rent their land to the drug traffickers for landing strips so the planes could land or the trucks could pass through. So there's a kind of a symbiotic relationship between a lot of the ranchers and the Pablo Escobars of the world. So that became this kind of a coalition of kind of more moneyed folks who decided that they had had enough of the guerrillas and wanted to fund a movement to finally eliminate them.
And like the symbiotic relationship that you're describing becomes even more incestuous as you go on, right? Because I read in human rights reports, and maybe even you contributed to them, that also the paramilitaries I'm sorry, not the paramilitaries. Well, actually, the paramilitaries and those that were in the cocaine trade business would essentially launder their money in land purchases. So then, like, not only did you have like the landed elites of Colombia and then the paramilitaries and then the cocaine distributors, but then you would kind of also have them buying the land. So then they all kind of became like a consolidated group in a way, and it became very hard to untangle that, right?
Yeah, I mean, just imagine, Escobar started in marijuana, or he actually going backwards, he actually started stealing gravestones. That was his kind of intro drug. And then he goes into marijuana. But imagine marijuana. It's big, like you need bales of it to effectively sell it. And that was kind of hard. And then marijuana production moved to Mexico. And so cocaine is like beautiful in the sense that it's very compact. You can, the raw cocaine that's coming from the coca fields it's like a brick, right? And then you refine it, and then it's very easy to transport then. And Escobar ended up buying, I think, the planes from Eastern Airlines after they went out of business. So he's flying literally jetliners full of cocaine. But the problem is, how do you bring the cash back? Because the cash is all like dollars. Yeah. So they would fly the cash back, but then they had the reverse problem that they had with marijuana. They had these bales of dollars, and they literally had so many dollars that they couldn't count them. So they ended up figuring out how much a bale of dollars was worth by weight. Right. And just like the amount of money that was coming into Colombia. So then what do you do? Okay, once you figure out, okay, so this bale of dollars is worth, I don't know, $500,000. So then what do you do? So you invested in land, you invested in buildings, you invested in whatever you can to put that money to service. So, a lot of and I'm not going to say who, but because I don't know, but that all of a sudden there's an explosion of building in Colombia, and Escobar is he's funding soccer fields and all, his home at the Hacienda Nápoles has a entire zoo, of exotic animals, which is still a problem in Colombia because he bought hippos. And the hippos, you've got these loose hippos now in Colombia that came from Escobar Zoo. So, there's all these kind of knock-on effects from just this immense amount of money that is coming into Colombia from cocaine trade. And it's also going into, weapons and ammunition and uniforms and rations for the paramilitaries. And for the FARC, by the way. The FARC is also profiting off of the drug trade in southern Colombia. So it's not exclusive to the paramilitaries.
Right, exactly. So you already mentioned this character named Carlos Castaño, who would kind of like be part of the evolution of the paramilitary movement, ultimately forming the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, better known as the AUC. One of the most incredible portions of your book is that you actually sat down with this group's founder and leader. Can you kind of just explain that experience of meeting with such an imposing figure? And like already in this interview, you've already kind of referenced kind of like what the paramilitary groups engage in. So, I mean, I have to imagine that was a very daunting experience.
It was daunting. It was, I think my goal in Colombia as a human rights researcher, human rights advocate, I should say, was to find ways to make a difference. I didn't want to just write about Colombia. I wanted to find how we could actually make a difference. And Castaño was always a really interesting character. In some ways, he was the younger brother. He has at least two older brothers, Jose Vicente, who I think is still alive, and Fidel, who was killed in an encounter with the FARC. And both Jose Vicente and Fidel were involved in the drug trade, along with Escobar. But the Carlos was someone who should have been a university professor in many ways. He had aspirations to learning about the world, traveling, but in fundamentally, when he was a young man, this was truncated by the murder of his father and the FARC, the war between the paramilitaries and the FARC, which was led by his brother Fidel mainly. And I had heard that Castaño had aspirations to be seen as a serious political leader, not in a kind of a neophyte kind of way like Escobar. Escobar ran for office, all that kind of thing. But he people had said to me, he really is interested in the world. And I took that as a kind of a challenge. Like, if he's interested in the world, then let me introduce him to one of the world's great achievements, which is the laws of war, which is international humanitarian law. And as a paramilitary leader with an organized force behind him, he needs to know that he is also subject to international humanitarian law. And I felt like, after talking with people, that he might actually want to discuss this. So I arranged to go and visit him. And the intermediary was a priest who was very well liked in northern Colombia. And so myself and a colleague, we got into some Jeeps and we drove for hours, and we ended up at this ranch in Somewheresville, Colombia, and there Castaño was. And as I had been told, he really wanted to talk about serious matters. And he actually gave us, the two of us, a report that the AUC had prepared on the situation of the elderly in one of the provinces of Colombia. It was almost like, that you would get it from a non-governmental organization. It was like, it had statistics and it had interviews. And it was like, this is what I had heard about him, that he had these aspirations to be a serious policymaker. So I'm trying to be, complimentary and, because I want to have this conversation in a serious way. And at the end of the report, there was a list of people that the report claimed were communists. And kind of going back to how we talked about like communism and stuff. And it turned out that the day before I went to see Castaño, I'd gone to interview this Jesuit priest who was in charge of dealing with all the refugees who were coming out of the areas Castaño controlled. And the name of this priest was on that list as a communist. And I realized what I was holding in my hand was a death list.
Right.
In the shape of a report on the elderly in Colombia. So I can't claim that our conversation ever made a difference, but that was the mindset that I went in there with. And, and I was also trying to use my identity, white lady identity as a kind of, that something that Colombians couldn't do.
Right.
And to say, because if my life had been lost there, it would have had serious repercussions.
Huge,
maybe not as serious as he would have thought. But, and he was also just extremely curious because we were the first human rights, foreign human, outside of Colombia, human rights people that he'd ever talked to. So that was kind of my mindset. And it was a crazy, nutty thing to do. But I think it was part of my commitment to trying to make a difference.
I think that's incredible. And I respect you very much for doing it as somebody who traveled in Colombia. And I did some interviews with some people, no one quite as that stature or like level of danger. But I absolutely respect that. And I think it's incredible, the work that you went down there to do.
I should also say, parenthesis, I also talked to the ELN and the FARC. So it was not wasn't paramilitaries, but because I had the same, point of view with the ELN, I met with them in prison where they were, and then two leaders. And then I also met with the EPL and in Northern Colombia and with the FARC in Mexico. So it was like, this was kind of my approach.
Right. Well, and kind of speaking to that as well, and also speaking to harrowing experiences that you went through. One of these is when you meet with a reformed, I used the word defector before, and you had corrected me on that, a reformed member of the guerrilla group, the ELN, named Fernando. During this meeting, you were directly in the crossfire of an assassination attempt. Would you mind just kind of describing that to the audience? Because reading that, I was like, this is insane.
Well, I think the thing about Colombia that was so different from Peru is that in Peru, you always knew when you were crossing a boundary, when you were going from, say, military control to shining path control. It was always quite clear. In Colombia, it was never clear. Like, you could be in the fanciest place in a city and something would happen. And that's what this was. I'd been invited to have a coffee with Fernando Fernandez, who was a former ELN commander, very well known in that part of Colombia. And he had taken advantage of a government plan to demobilize and had become somehow the head of the Human Rights Commission of the Colombian Congress. So I was like thrilled to meet with him and went to a fancy restaurant in Medellin. And he was sitting opposite me in this restaurant, and the restaurant had a kind of a little garden in the middle under an open area. Medellin's got beautiful weather, so this was an open area. So there's all these plants in the middle of the restaurant, and he kept his hand in his briefcase, and I was like, oh, maybe his hand is hurt.
Yeah, it's an important document in there.
And then we hear shots outside, and he immediately, as the good gorilla he was, goes to the plants. And he's crouching behind this banana tree. And what he'd been holding on to the whole time was this enormous gun. Yeah. So he's pointing the gun at the door. And I'm on my knees at that point, crawling to the women's bathroom, because that was the one place I thought, maybe I should go to the women's bathroom.
It's good thinking, thinking on your feet in the middle. Like, I can't knock you for that. I think that's even to be able to discern that, like, there it is right there and crawl to it. I think that's
right there. Right. And I don't know why I thought, like, why not the men's bathroom? Anyway. Yeah. But, and then the shooting stopped, and it turned out, so then he says to me something like, oh, that wasn't an assassination attempt. That was someone trying to steal my truck. Oh. And I was like, oh, okay. And unfortunately, they had hit one of his bodyguards, and the truck and the bodyguards had left for the hospital. So he was unprotected at that point. So he asked me, would it be okay if I went with him in a taxi to his office? And I was like, sure.
You're like a human shield at that point.
What it does. So I dropped him off at his office, went on to my next appointment, which was with a labor rights group. And I told them this story, like, haha, funny, Fernando Fernandez. And they tried to
and they were like,
steal this truck. And they're like, Robin, what is wrong with you? That was an assassination attempt, one of several,
Yeah.
that had been happening recently. And I was just like, oh, okay, noted.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That was incredible to read. Just because I know we're running out of time, I want to make sure I get to these topics. So you state in your book that there is no better place to see the effect of the United States in Colombia than the state of Putumayo. This statement has personal resonance with me because I spent a week in Putumayo earlier this year. Can you explain why Putumayo is such an important illustration of U.S. policy in Colombia?
Well, at the time, it was because the U.S. was sending a lot of military aid to Colombia. And when the U.S. sends military aid, it looks amazing, like billions of dollars. But what it often is, and it certainly was the case in Colombia, it's equipment. Yeah. So it's Black Hawk helicopters, it's Jeeps, it's all this stuff that actually doesn't belong to the receptor country. It still belongs to the United States. Those Black Hawks don't become Colombian.
Right.
And a Black Hawk is, at the time, I think it was like $36 million. So, so the United States had drawn this square, literally on a map, had drawn this square around an area where coca was being cultivated, the coca being the plant where you extract cocaine from.
Yes.
So all of the military aid was supposed to stay in the box. And of course, Castaño in 1996 flies right to the middle of the box, and he conducts a massacre at a little town called Mapiripan, which went for days. So it was just like it was just an insane idea that you could box out the political violence in Colombia by just drawing something on a map. And Castaño was, I don't know what his thinking was about this, but that the way you're fighting this FARC is even more powerful because it's making taxes off of this this trade. So it became just like an example of who is developing this policy with this idea that you're going to be able to suppress the drug trade at the source when the attraction is so powerful because the consumers are still going to be there. So the drug trade is just going to shift. So that's why I thought Putumayo was a great example of how U.S. policy was just, if anything, counterproductive.
And just to talk about my personal experience a little bit, my visit to Putumayo was enlightening because I always assumed that coca production in Colombia occurred in some like distant location, remote location, guarded by armed guards, far from the view of someone like me. However, I quickly learned that there's vast coca fields that surround the roads. Like I would just drive down the street and I'm looking out the window and my friend's like, that's all coca right there. And I was like, it blew my mind. And I visited an indigenous reservation too. And I'm not going to name them specifically because of what I'm about to say, but it was replete with coca fields within the indigenous reservation as well. So it was like, it blew my mind that I was just literally walking through coca fields. It's like wheat fields in the Midwest or something.
Yeah, like corn in Illinois. Yeah. I'm really glad you've got to go because it's, and also the plants themselves.
Yeah.
The Colombians are really good business people. And so they have agronomists and botanists who have worked on those plants so that the alkaloid content in the leaves is astronomically higher than it was in the 90s. So they need, they need fewer plants and each plant can be harvested multiple times a year. So it's it is an industry.
Well, and just keeping with that it is an industry, right? Is that we have this war on drugs. We have all this money that we give to Colombia. We have the Colombian, military ostensibly trying to eradicate coca production. But when I was there, I actually asked someone that was kind of like a tour guide to me, let's say that they accomplished that. So apparently during COVID, there was a recession in Colombia because people were using less cocaine, I guess, because they were going out less. If you actually eradicated cocaine production in Colombia, what would that do to the economy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think it is to this day, it's a significant part of the economy. I don't think some Colombians, I'm sure, use cocaine. Most consumers are outside Colombia or in the United States or in Europe or what have you. But yeah, it is I think at one point in the 90s, it was $45 billion a year coming into Colombia. And a lot of that obviously is, going into bribery or other things, but it's an immense source of cash. I mean, I think Colombians would say that they would rather not have it because it deforms the country in so many different ways. But yeah, it would be a huge change in the way the country is run.
Well, and just to go off that a little bit too, that they would rather do something else. Like I spoke to people in Putumayo that were literally manning, that were working these fields. And like, they say we would rather not do this, but we have very few alternatives. The way that I understand it, like, so first of all, if you've never been to Putumayo, you might not understand this. Like outside of Puerto Asís and this town Dorada that I was in, there was virtually no paved roads or anything like that. Like the concept of growing yucca or bananas or something like that, and imagining some tractor trailer driving out. The indigenous reservation I was on, you couldn't even get to by car. You had to fill wheelbarrows and walk it over a walking bridge. So it's like, yucca, it spoils more quickly. There's way less return on it. You can harvest it less. And then like, if you were to really transform that, it would be so much more difficult. This is what I heard is that, and I think this had something to do with NAFTA as well, like where like the neoliberal trade agreements that kind of like made domestically produced goods less valuable on the market. So it's like, it seems like the people that are caught right in the middle of this through no fault of their own are the ones that like, they're in such a bind that they can't really get out of it at this point. There's no real alternative. Would you agree with that sentiment?
No, absolutely. And there's a whole, you probably know some of this, there's a whole history to the boom and bust economy in that part of the world. And one of the early times when this was happening was with the rubber trade. Rubber used to be entirely derived from trees, right?
Oh, okay, sorry.
And so the rubber trade was another one of these extractive industries that just deformed the Putumayo for many years, and then suddenly, with the advent of really the 1930s, factories were able to create synthetic rubber,
right.
And it just devastated the rubber economy in both in Malaysia and in Colombia. So there's been this boom and bust for a long time. I mean, I would be curious, honestly, to know. I mean, I think I haven't looked recently, but the cocaine imports, I think, are relatively stable. But I'd be sort of curious to know how some of the more what is it? I don't know. It's not designer drugs, but lab-based drugs, like fentanyl and ketamine. How much usage, just the fashion, has changed to other kinds of drugs that aren't, essentially organic, based.
In a way, yeah.
Right, kind of like marijuana and cocaine are at least plant-based, but fentanyl and ketamine are not. So I'd be curious to know if usage patterns have changed. I would suspect not.
Maybe not significantly. I'm not sure either. So just quick, because I know we have a few minutes left here. We've been talking about all this, through Plan Colombia and all these, I guess, billions of dollars at this point that the United States has funneled into Colombia for the ostensible purpose of eradicating the cocaine trade. And then also the Colombian military essentially saying like, yes, that's why we're using this money. But like through reading your book and other sources, isn't it true that there's more of like a duplicitous kind of like understanding of that money? Like, because the Colombian government, if they're working with the paramilitaries and the paramilitaries are also the traffickers, it seems like they're more concerned with rooting out subversives with that money than they are with actually any kind of like meaningful effect to the production of cocaine.
I mean, that was always our argument to the U.S. government. It's like, you can't separate these two things and say we're only funding anti-drug stuff. We're not helping the paramilitaries. It could because the two were, one and the same. And I remember at one point talking to someone on Capitol Hill and just saying, I had a report that had been actually done by a Colombian government agency about this one admiral who was one of the top Navy officers in Colombia and was responsible for a lot of the trafficking that was coming out of northern Colombia, Santa Marta, which is, a lot of the fast boats were coming out of that northern coastal area towards the United States. And our argument was, why are we giving this guy money if he's basically playing both sides of this?
Money to eradicate the drug trade, by the way. The money is for the stated purpose of fighting the exact thing he's doing.
And I think that the answer is it resides in American politics. Like, it is much easier to point the finger south than it is to point the finger at ourselves and say, can we start talking about legalization? Can we start talking seriously about what it would take to go back to Richard Nixon and say, this is a health issue. This is a poverty issue. This is an issue that we are never going to solve through the, George H.W. Bush lens of war. Like he was the one that started this rhetorical approach, like the war on drugs. It's like it is never going to work. If we talk about it as a public health issue, it allows us to talk about addiction, allows us to talk about treatment, allows us to talk about education. Doesn't eliminate the problem, but the idea of harm reduction, it would make the problem so much less potent and also drain a lot of the money out of it if we legalize. Now there's all sorts of issues around legalizing, potent drugs like cocaine and heroin. There's also heroin fields in Colombia. Yeah. But I would rather have that conversation than continue to throw good money after bad in this war frame.
Robin Kirk, I know you got to go. I want to thank you so much for coming on here and speaking with us. We're a relatively small channel, but we're very passionate about what we do. So thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today.
Well, I'm so glad you got to go to Colombia. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and talk to real Colombians about this. And thank you so much for the invitation. It was lovely to talk.
Personally, I would love to actually read through some of your work in Peru. I mean, maybe if you'd be interested in coming on again in the future, we could have a deeper discussion about that.
That'd be lovely. I'd love it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate everything you do. Thank you.
Don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. And treat them like that and fight them, and you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. Be a low style. Style got thrown out the car. Guys with subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or subversive or red radical. Guys with subversive plots. Red radical. And fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We group us up like ants in a colony. Organize the wealth into a socialist economy. Based off the combinators, and all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we just spreading the scene. And all my comrades